the name of the God of love, whoever lives, that we may live in love. Amen. Friends, let's just pause. Let's just pause after those really quite strange words, yet words of great beauty. In much of my work life, I don't know what to say at the moment. I feel a bit perplexed. I feel a bit like my words don't matter. It isn't like I don't have stuff to say. My God, at times I feel like I'm going to explode. But when I do, I seem to pitch it wrongly. Or it makes absolutely no difference. And it leaves me feeling sort of absurd, frustrated, and disempowered. It's odd because I think I'm still kind of like chatty man around the parish. You're supposed to agree with me at that point, okay? But perhaps in places where I feel more exposed, like in the diocese, I feel that nobody is actually interested in what I'm saying. And it is extremely isolating because I end up feeling like a mad person. And let's face it, nobody likes to be around the nutter, do they? I don't know, perhaps some of you can relate to what I'm saying. And I know a couple of people have already emailed after reading it in the pew sheet this week. I had the same feelings of feeling a bit perplexed, and that being, something that was making me have anxiety about preaching on today's gospel. I felt perplexed and confused. I've never actually really known what to think about what we call the Transfiguration, the reading that Keith has just eloquently read to us. Was it some kind of psychedelic experience? I mean, what were they smoking? What went up? What went on up on that mountaintop? Where Elijah and Moses apparently appear. It's all floodlit, like at Pride Park. I find it hard to identify with that kind of heavenly sparkle, that kind of magic. Because my own life and my faith seem pretty down here in the dirt of daily life, really. But I do relate to Peter in this story. Because Peter didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to say because the gospel writer tells us Peter was terrified. That little sentence explaining Peter's inability to speak was something of an epiphany for me. I saw things in a new light. For something in it rang true for me. As many of you know, it's been a bit of a year for me and for my family. And today's reading, for some reason, took me back to the moment late in the summer when, having been to Spain on holiday, I got off the EasyJet flight and turned my phone back on, and suddenly message after message after message came pinging in on my phone, with various people telling me that the roof of St. Mark's Church, one of the other churches in our fellowship, had collapsed. Since then, we've had a serious arson attack at St. Osmond's, one of the other churches in the fellowship, which sort of blew out the end wall. The ceiling had already collapsed at St. Osmond's, by the way. And then a few weeks ago, the east wall, sort of the big wall behind the altar at St. Mark's, literally collapsed into the community centre, destroying it. Thanks be to God, nobody was hurt or killed. But all the community groups have been made homeless. The food bank closed and has had to move. Reverend Sarah who's been a real support and was a real support through COVID, Reverend Sarah, has left for pastures new, which means we're now covering St Philip's in a closer way. And as we all know, our love is with Father Anthony at the moment, who is so very, very sick. And then to cap it all off, this little litany, last week we had quite a serious lead theft at St Osmond's, which has wrecked much of the remaining roof. And. Apparently, I'm still supposed to maintain business as usual, get everything solved. So I suddenly realised that, like Peter, perhaps I can't get the words out because perhaps in some way, at the moment, I'm terrified about the future. Now, friends, why am I telling you this? It's like a sort of personal story today. Well, I think we have all forgotten, all of us, far too quickly, that in our recent past, we have all been dealing with the most extraordinary terror and disempowering effects of the pandemic and the lockdown. Do you remember that? All those years ago? It's like ancient history, isn't it? There's hardly a single person I know whose priorities for life and whose life choices and whose expectations of what they want from their lives have not been radically altered by those months of terror that we all lived through. It is completely clear the Church of England will never recover from the pandemic in the way that, the money people want it to. You can clearly identify at school the year group that were just toddlers when the pandemic started, and they did those toddler years, those nursery years, through the social isolation of lockdown. You can identify them as they move through the school. And yet in our society's social amnesia, it can feel like, did it actually happen? Nah, get over it. So maybe, like me, you are in a phase where you don't know what to say, where you can't get words out all the time, because our lives have gone through their own kind of transfiguration and radical change. And so it makes sense that we all have moments, perhaps, where words fail to describe what is in our hearts. So I reckon that God likely thinks it's okay when we don't know what to say. Because when Peter can't find the words on the Mount of the Transfiguration, God doesn't say to Peter, "Oi, Peter, here's a PowerPoint presentation for you to explain what it's all about to the disciples." God says, "This is my beloved. Listen to him." When we don't know what to say, what is in our hearts, God says, "Listen." I realised I've been struggling so hard to get the words out. I have been so busy lying about being on top of everything that I have simply stopped listening to other people. They haven't isolated me. I have isolated myself. No, things aren't okay at the moment. The situation is indeed terrible. And on top of what I may feel I am dealing with, our society really seems to be collapsing. Children are being murdered in Gaza, refugees being treated abominably by our own country. And I don't know about you, but my life feels pretty damn fragile. So what if it's okay to be quiet? To go through a quiet season. And what if going through this quiet season is just an invitation for us to listen? For me to listen to myself, to listen to others who are trying to help, to listen to Jesus. Because when I'm terrified and preoccupied with my own need to get the words out, I transfer my fear onto the other people and blame them. And then it is actually hard, if not impossible, to listen. Friends, listening is the antidote to our fear of the unknown, the antidote to our fear of not knowing what the future holds. So I said to myself, Julian, you don't have to have something to say. Just listen, boy. But that's easier said than done. Jesus isn't standing in front of us in flesh and blood like he was for the disciples. So how are we supposed to listen to Jesus? Well, can I point out first of all, even if Jesus was standing in front of us, that's no guarantee we'd listen any better than the disciples, because they failed to do so over and over again. Remember when Jesus had finished celebrating the Last Supper and the disciples are all still at the table with him, they immediately start arguing about which one of them is the most important. He's literally just broken bread and lifted the cup and said, "This is my body, this is my blood," for the very first time. I mean, it was the mountaintop experience, the ultimate message that we are all one in Jesus. And they were actually there to hear it, and none of them were listening. So if the disciples found it hard to listen, and Jesus didn't give up on them, how much more mercy will God show me and show us when we find it hard to listen? And in that moment, I realized that listening is God's gift to us. God's gift of filling us up with the grace that we don't have for ourselves. Listening is God's way of telling us that we do not have to do it on our own. That as we face sometimes the very real terror of being alive, we don't always have to have words. We can lean into each other. If this extraordinarily weird gospel story says anything to me, it is that we do not have to understand it all ourselves. We cannot begin to receive that grace from someone else until we slow down and listen. So this week, my dear friends, as we move into Lent, I pray that God bless us with stillness. Enough stillness that we can listen to our own hearts, listen to others, and maybe receive the radiance of that grace that we so often do not feel able to see in ourselves.